She laughed like it was a strategy. "Really, Rebecca?" Leela Lang's voice cut the boardroom in half. Bright, practiced, the kind of laugh that always landed in the right seat. "That dress, is this peasant chic the new thing we can't afford to ignore?" At least 15 people exhaled together, small, polite sounds that were all measurement and alignment. Cameras on phones shifted. Someone pretended not to look at the hem. Richard Lang smiled like a man who'd just pointed out a flaw in a painting and expected applause. Rebecca felt the flush move across her cheeks the way a shadow moves under glass. It registered, only for a second. Then she returned to the paper in front of her, to the spreadsheet with the glossy column headings, to the thin, expensive pen between her fingers. The laugh rolled past her and found new targets. The intern who tried to hide a smirk, the senior counsel who glanced down as if searching for a reason to be offended by something more than a fashion choice. No one looked at the seam where a tiny weight was sewn into the lining of her dress. No one saw the neat stitch that held a coin of metal flat against fabric, the way a moth tucks itself against bark. Leela could mock the surface. The surface was not why Rebecca wore the dress. "She looks like she raided a vintage shop in the wrong decade," Leela continued, as if warming to the point. "I mean, Rebecca, the marketing department puts millions in runway impressions. Why do you insist on looking like you wandered out of a thrift store?" It was cruel. It was expected. It did its job. Folded the room inward on Rebecca like a map closing. She had heard worse. Whispers outside elevators, offhanded comments that were supposed to be harmless. But the voice of the VP's daughter was the sound of entitlement weaponized, of inherited security made personal. Rebecca let it pass. When silence stretched thin enough for someone to speak, Richard chuckled, a sound of ownership, and steered the conversation back to the deck on the screen. "Enough. Let's address the work proposal. Numbers first." The room obeyed. The slide advanced. Figures slid across the projector like bright fish. Rebecca listened to the cadence of fiscal confidence and knew exactly where the creases would show. A line item miscategorized, a client rebate buried in a footnote, a liability footnote nobody had the time to read. Her eyes kept drifting to the hem, to the secret sewn into it, the weight that lived inside fabric like a small heart. After the meeting, there was the ritual. Rebecca slid her hand inside the small pocket in the dress, brushing the token to confirm it was still there, a habit as old as obligation. It was flat, the size of a manhole in miniature, stamped with an emblem half hidden by age, a crown of laurel, 2 cross lines, and the initials EH. The metal had a patina that made it look ordinary until you knew to look for it. Most people wouldn't. Most people couldn't. She'd never talk about the token, not in the open. It served a function that wasn't swagger or claim. It was proof, a whisper that belonged in archives and vaults and the pockets of old photographs. It was tied to a name people said only in sighs, Edmund Hson, a financier who had not been on the board for a long time, but had been on the balance sheets in ways that took a microscope and a memory to see. The name suggested stories no one in the office wanted to talk about. Emergency loans under the table, quiet strings pulled during a late-night sell-off, a resignation with an envelope worth more than a year of bonuses. Rebecca carried the token because someone had taught her how to carry things smaller than reputation and larger than daily survival. She had learned the art of being unseen in plain clothes. The dress was both camouflage and certificate. It was structured just enough to keep whispers at bay. The token was the only loud thing she owned, and it had been stitched inside at her grandmother's insistence. Keep it close. Don't let the world wear your proof like jewelry. Keep it where it can hide and be found. Leela's barb would be a gossip loop for the day. It would travel outwards, text to text, elevator to elevator, and settle in the corners of the cafeteria like a smell people pretended not to notice. A viral, tiny humiliation. That was how power was enforced at her level. A joke at the right moment, repeated in the right apartments. Rebecca let the story run its usual circuit. She returned to her desk, to the monitor with the slow company logo in the corner, and opened the secure tab she used for other people's histories. A message blinked, an encrypted ping from a contact that used to be higher than Rebecca, but was now safely ashore somewhere else. She thumbed it open, eyes on the numbers first, fingers on ritual. 9 words. Keep still. Watch. Wait. She typed back. On it. It was enough. She had learned to calibrate speed to leverage. Haste got you noticed. Patience signed the ledger. Between the mocking and the mundane, the building moved like any other fortress of commerce. Air-conditioned confidence, coffee stations humming, security badges like stamps of comfort. Phones clattered,
Calendar invites pinged like small artillery. The company's logos sat proudly on the glass walls, framed like the kind of laurels executives like to hang in corridors. Their weight mattered to them. To Richard Lang, it mattered like oxygen. Richard sat at the head of the table with the casual repose of someone who believes that structure bends to personality. He had the VP title, the dot of their daughter, and the straight jaw that made every rumor about nepotism feel inevitable. He spoke with an economy that ate proposals for breakfast and left decisions to digest on their own. Numbers look clean, he said now, until they don't. We keep calm, we keep close. Rook, trust us. That matters.
Leela smiled, and in that smile was a map of what she expected the world to be. She was 28, with features designed like an advertisement for advantage. Her laugh landed on the comfortable side of cruelty because she was used to people always greeting it like currency. She had been raised on the idea that public cutting is a form of curation. The office had been taught to ingest her cuts as if they were editorial notes. Rebecca looked at them both and felt no heat of anger, only an old, distant, surgical logic that had nothing to do with fashion. The Rourke proposal sat on the table like a polished bone. Elias Rourke was not a man who arrived in the same way most clients did. He arrived like a consequence, heavy, unavoidable, and sure of his own gravity. When he did come through the doors, the air in the building changed. His name carried weight that bent the invisible currency of meetings and memos. He was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which in corporate practice translates as an announcement that he would appear sometime between 3 and 3:20, depending on the mood of his driver, the weather of the street, and the angle of private security. He did not take kindly to waiting. People arranged themselves around the schedule like servants preparing for a visit from a king with a ledger. By 2:45, the trio of Richard, Leela, of his senior partners clustered near the entrance to the boardroom like a small court. They arranged their clothes, made final jabs, adjusted light tones of insult into comic timing. It was performance. Everyone had lines. Rebecca stayed seated. She did not fold into the pre-arrival choreography. That was partly by training and partly by temperament. She had spent years studying small signs, the way a man pinched the bridge of his nose when he lied about a line item, the slight shift in someone's voice when a client was a problem they had to hide. Her powers were observational and oriented at detail. The token inside her dress helped focus that attention, a thing dull to everyone else and luminous to those who knew what to look for. When the building announced the guest, it did so with the low hum of elevators and the shift of the receptionist posture. "Mr. Rourke is here," she said, like a bell rung in a cathedral. No one looked like they were surprised. The lobby filled with silence and the fragrance of old leather and decisions. Rourke entered the room not so much with a step as with a settlement. He was in his late 60s, not gaunt but edged with the kind of health money buys. His hair was white at the temples, and his suit carried no logos, only the quiet balance of a closet that never had to shout. He wore gloves, thin, cream-colored leather gloves that met his cuffs with the precision of someone who never wanted the oil of the world clinging to his skin. He moved like a man who had been invited in because of something he already carried. Cause, account, power. There was a smell about him like old paper and cedar, the kind of scent that lived in houses where people kept ledgers. People tended to step back without thinking, faces smoothed. Even Leela's smile was snap-frozen for a breath. Rebecca watched him pass through the sliding doors. He paused at the end of the corridor and scanned the room with a practiced, appraising eye. He took the seat opposite Richard, and the meeting began under his gaze. He did not speak for several minutes. Instead, he watched. People spoke into his pause as if a vacuum had been dropped into the room, and words would fall into it like offerings. Presentations were given, promises were repeated. Rebecca delivered her part, sober, exact, the little contradictions placed like markers under a microscope. As she spoke, the projector flared, and lines of profit marched across the screen. Rourke's attention at some point shifted, not to Rebecca's charts, not to Richard's cadence, but to the way a thread of fabric near her wrist caught the light. He leaned back, head tilted, and the small sound of fabric turning under motion reached him halfway across the room. It was the sound you hear when someone fidgets with a piece of jewelry, metal kissing cloth. Rebecca felt his glance like a feather. She placed her hand, for any observer, in a natural pose, fingers like a page-turner at a book. Her thumb brushed the inside seam where the token lay concealed. The motion was small. To everyone else, it was an absent-minded adjustment. To Rourke, the gesture read like a map. He was old enough to remember faces and heirlooms as facts of currency. He knew the language of emblems. The token's emblem, the laurel, the crossed lines, the initials, was something he had seen before,
Not in meetings or in press kits, but in old photographs and in a ledger he had once been allowed to touch. In the way he looked, you could see the ghost of a memory making the room reframe. The hum in the boardroom narrowed. People kept talking because that is what keeps rattled things from falling apart. Work did not interrupt. He watched, and watching was a kind of accumulation. After a moment that meant nothing and then everything, he put his gloves together in his lap and said without motion toward the speaker, "Excuse me." It was a soft command, not raised, not dramatic, but it held the aircaster power of something larger than social civility. No one left the meeting, but a line of attention shifted like a tide scraping stones. Richard asked, "Are we taking a—" Work did not answer him. Instead, he rose and walked to Rebecca, the way a man walks toward the last thing that will settle an old account. The room became background, the folding chairs and the advertising posters blurred. People saw through, like on-screen credits over a main image. Leela's smile tightened into something like a bruise.
He stopped within a step of Rebecca and bent, not in a bow, but in a small lean that put his eyes on what she had hidden. The token flashed where it had always flashed for the few who knew to look. A glint of metal against the dark fabric of the lining, the initials catching a beam of light. Rourke's expression didn't change much, only that his mouth tilted in the faintest acknowledgement. He touched the emblem with the tip of a gloved finger, not to claim it, but as if to confirm that the symbol was still the same as the one he'd kept in a photograph album. "Is that—" he began. Rebecca heard the whisper of the room pull taut, as if someone had tightened piano wire. The air conditioning seemed to dip. The fluorescent lights seemed to steady above them like watchful eyes. Conversation arrested itself mid-sentence. The projector's glow felt invasive. Richard opened his mouth and closed it. He took a step forward, not trusting his chair to be authoritative enough. "Mr. Rourke." Rourke didn't look at him. He looked at Rebecca and then down at the token again. He was an old man used to doors opening with a key. He unlocked nothing now, not yet. He only recognized. Recognition in rooms like this acts like an amplifier. The old associations a man carries into a meeting can render a boardroom into a courtroom with a single look. Something small becomes a lever. Private histories rearrange the furniture of public spaces. Rebecca had expected attention. She had not expected the air to feel like a held breath. She felt suddenly, acutely, how fragile the architecture of comfort was. Richard's fingers twitched on the table. Leela's chin lifted slightly, the tiny posture of someone bracing for applause or blame depending on how fortune fell. Rourke lingered beside her for a beat that held weight instead of time. He lifted his hand and with a motion that could have been either courtesy or necessity, asked softly, "May I?" Rebecca's hands were empty. She hadn't planned to make the token public. No one in that room knew what it meant. At least, she assumed not. But the man's question, gentle and unexpected, had the kind of authority that did not need to be argued with. She nodded once. He reached toward the seam and with gloved care eased it open enough for the metal to slide free. The token came out like an old coin. In the reflect of the boardroom lights, the embossed initials caught and held the light, throwing off a small defiant signal. For the first time in the room, someone gasped. Not out of melodrama, but the sound you make when a memory aligns with a present object and tells you something you weren't invited to know. Rourke held the token as if weighing not merely its age but its function. "Edmund H. Hassan," he murmured. The name hit the room with a soft thud. There it was, spoken aloud for the first time that day. In a single syllable, the air shifted again, like the closing note of a symphony, but without the instruments. The name carried a past full of uneven ledgers, emergency interventions, and favors that could not easily be accounted for on a quarterly report. It suggested a history the firm had never quite laid out publicly, not because it had been malicious, but because it had been messy and useful, and then inconvenient. Conversation in the room became an attempt to get back to business, as if nothing of magnitude had shifted. Richard's jaw tightened. "Mr. Rourke," he said thinly, "with all due respect, this is a commercial meeting. We should—" Rourke glanced at him. The man had the look of someone who was not wagering on respect as currency. "This is not a commercial meeting, Mr. Lang," he said, and there was calm in his voice that felt more like a seal being broken than a rebuke. "Not today." Around them, people tried to pretend they had not just been nudged into presences larger than they had signed up for. Phones were flipped face down.
A junior associate's fingers hovered like trapped birds over a phone screen, unsure whether to call, record, or run. Rebecca kept her face composed in that small, regulated way that people in public often adopt. Inside, a tide of things she'd made notes about years ago rose: names, memos, a ledger with a missing entry that her grandmother had hinted at on a winter morning. She thought of petty humiliations like Leela's comment as particles that coalesced into a wave. The dress insult had been a provocation, an attempt to place her properly in a hierarchy. Instead, it had done what noise sometimes does. It had drawn attention to the one thing that could not be mocked away. Work looked around the room and then back at the token, and in that motion the outline of a decision began to appear. He slipped the emblem back into the seam with a finality that felt like refiling an old claim. He folded his gloves over his lap and said, softly but with a reach that made people straighten, "This room should convene in private. Now." There are orders that act like anchors. They do not thrum with drama. They simply cause the world to rearrange itself. Phones went into pockets. Jackets rose. Chairs squeaked. Richard made a face that was not yet fear, but the first shape of worry. "Security?" someone asked. The question hovered, seeking the thing a corporate environment always has at hand: procedure. People like brackets when things go wrong. Rourke did not answer. He stood and walked toward the door where the assistant kept the sealed envelope turnkeyed with firm policy, and behind it a small brass box he took up from somewhere he'd reserved for emergencies. Perhaps he carried it always, a relic of whatever old-world practice allowed billionaires to keep the records they needed to make the present answer to the past. As he walked, his gait said he had been in the position of deciding when to break into other people's histories, and had done it before.
It said he had the patience to open a sealed letter and the appetite to read an inconvenient clause aloud. It said he had the means to make a boardroom stop being an exercise in PR and become a tribunal if necessary. Rebecca watched him walk and felt the outsized, slant light of possibility fall on the room. She did not panic. She did not gloat. She only noticed how little the fabric of office life takes to be undone: a token, a name, and a man who remembers. At her desk later, after people had been shepherded into separate rooms, and Richard was in a corridor making flurried calls he could not make sound panicky, she updated a single line on a private spreadsheet. It was the kind of small administrative thing that would matter later: note of Rourke's arrival, time, and the token exposure. She sent a silent message, not to legal, not to PR, but to someone she trusted on the inside of compliance. The message read, "You saw. Now is the time." Alan from compliance replied with 2 cautious words and a timestamp: "We are watching." Across the building, in glass offices and behind closed doors, the firm reorganized itself like a deck of cards someone had shaken to see what would fall. A secretary locked a file drawer. A lawyer rubbed the bridge of his nose and reread a footnote as if it might hide a loophole. The sound of people organizing their defenses has a particular rhythm: typing, whispering, the clack of shoes on marble. Outside the windows, the city went on as if nothing unusual had happened. Traffic carried its old grievances. A dog down the block tugged at a leash. The world is good at continuing. Rebecca took off the dress in her office restroom later and slid the token into the palm of her hand. It lay there like a small, patient object, patient with its own past. She considered its worn edges, the tiny scratches that told a story of being handled more than is polite. She thought of her grandmother's hands, of stories told in low voices by a bedside lamp. The token had been a private inheritance, not wealth in the way the office thought of money, but a claim that mattered to the architecture of power. Someone knocked at her door, soft, polite, as if inquiring rather than intruding. A young associate came in with 2 paper cups of coffee. "We heard they pulled everyone into the green room," she said, voice pitched as if to offer company. Her eyes moved involuntarily to Rebecca's desk, which was a neutral plane of tidy notes and a tempered calm. "What happened in there? Did work make a scene?" Rebecca handed the token back into the seam and adjusted the lining as one tucks a secret into a pocket. She smiled without teeth. "Not yet," she said, "but it will." The young associate's face was the map of somebody who hadn't been in the firm long enough to know how to hold someone else's secret. "Is it true? About Tykeson?" she whispered, like a rumor that attains gravity the closer it is capped to the chest. Rebecca thought of the token and how it functioned as a key, not to a lock, but to a ledger. "There's more than one history in this company," she said. "Some of them are worth uncovering." At 3:35, the small conference rooms filled with people who had work to do
and suddenly did not know whether their work would endure. Phones buzzed and were deliberately ignored. The firm's PR director sent an email proposing language that would make the situation sound like a routine confirmation. Legal drafted a memo that meant nothing and everything at once. The building hummed with the business of people trying to make consequences into sentences and figures. In the executive suite, Richard paced, and his face shifted into the angles of an actor who had been handed a script where the stage directions were in a different language. He dialed a number. It went unanswered. He dialed again, faster now, and this time someone picked up, and he spoke into the phone with the brittle politeness of a man who had never been told no. "Delay them," he said. "Keep them there. Do not let work move on." "Sir," the voice from the other end said, cool and very far away. "He's in your building. He asked for the sealed agreement. Whatever you do, don't make a spectacle." Richard's jaw worked. "Then we keep everyone in the room until we can—" "You don't get to keep him," the voice replied. "The man decides. You'd best keep your explanations ready." People in offices across the corridor listened to snippets of this playlist and felt the particular cold of potential insolvency of reputation, the hours when reputation recalculates and asks for collateral in truth. Rebecca, in the privacy of a restroom stall, closed her eyes. Memory is a place where notifications arrive slow. She thought of Edmund Aitchen's name again, and the way it tasted when Rourke said it, like the first note of a melody that meant trouble if you did not know how to follow. She felt the dress like a worn map across her skin, and the token like a waypoint. The boardroom cleared itself into clusters. The senior partners gathered quickly and with the kind of hush that signals old habits of secrecy returning. Rourke sat back down, folded his hands, and opened a small leather case. Inside, among other things that smelled faintly of cedar and paper, there was a photograph with faded edges. It featured a younger Edmund Aitchen in a suit that suggested solidity. Behind him were the early faces of the company's founding, the kind of people who had once sat down and signed things that now had the weight to undo. Rourke placed the picture on the table and slid it toward Richard. The movement was small but intentional. It was an invitation to account for the past on a surface that still mattered: paper. Richard leaned forward, the picture becoming suddenly heavy. "What is this for?" he asked. He sounded like a man asking an inconvenient child a question he should not have to answer.
Rourke tapped the photograph with a gloved finger. The token was not on the picture, it was on Rebecca's dress. But the photograph connected the 2 points, past and present, with the strain of implied history. "I keep records," Rourke said, "and sometimes when a sign appears where one has been hidden, it is polite to see what it opens." There was a quiet that is not silence, but the orchestral pause before instruments strike, a corporate inhalation. People understood, suddenly, that the meeting might not resume the way it had planned. "We need the sealed founding agreement," someone said, low, careful. It was a phrase that carried with it 1,000 possible outcomes. A clause read aloud could rearrange corporate authority. Words on paper could make a seat on the board feel like an appointment revoked or a coronation deferred. The mention of a sealed agreement placed the word founding in the room like an old photograph taking weight. For most people, founding documents are abstract, dusty things in binders that executives cite when convenient. But the right clause, forged in the right moment, is a hinge. It turns the door of power. Rourke watched them, folded hands resting on the table like a judge keeping a gavel. He did not act like a man who wanted a show. He acted like a man who had seen the world make itself over on the basis of a line in a book, and who knew, from long experience, that one good line read aloud is stronger than 1,000 polite denials. Rebecca stayed silent. She had no announcements to make. She had only the small, resolute fact of the token, and the knowledge of how paper archives never forget, as long as there are eyes to read them. Around her, people whispered. Leela's face sharpened with something she could not yet name. Embarrassment, anger, fear, who knew? The child of a powerful man does not like to watch an old ledger point toward her. When Rourke stood and asked for the sealed documents to be retrieved, the motion was a quiet one that did what it needed to. It pushed the meeting into motion without dramatic flair. An assistant left the room to go fetch what had been kept somewhere precisely for the moment when past deeds and present events had to be reconciled. People moved with the new choreography. Phones were put away. Briefcases came open. Richard paced toward the windows, then stopped, hands flat on glass. He watched the city like someone waiting for permission from the skyline. Leela folded her hands and breathed in a way that said her day had been misread. The assistant returned not long after with a slim, sealed envelope. It had been kept in a private file,
a place built for things that might one day need to be found, a place where people hid their truths to be revealed on someone else's timetable. The envelope was not a drama piece. It was a legal artifact with a small ribbon and the faint smell of archival paste.
Rourke took it, and, with the caution of a man opening a safe deposit box at midnight, slit the ribbon. The room grew small around him. He unfolded the pages and scanned them, not with the hunger of a detective, but the patience of a reader who knows what a clause can reorganize. He stopped at one paragraph and held the page up. "It reads," he said, and his voice was a quiet instrument adjusting to the key of the room, "that in the event an heir to Edmund Aitchison presents the token of identification and is recognized by a principal client, that heir shall be granted observational authority with the right to access corporate accounts and to request audits. This authority may not be dismissed by simple vote without the concurrence of 2/3 of the founding trustees." The words landed like stones in a pond. People moved as if the water had shifted. Some reached for phones they had decided would be irrelevant. The phrase observational authority was not earth-shattering on its face, but in context it meant something subtly enormous. Access, transparency, an institutional lever that could unglue comfortable arrangements. Richard's face went pale in a way that moral indignation rarely produces, the kind of pale produced by someone who knows their scaffolding may have been built on movable earth. Leela covered her mouth with the numbness of someone who has seen a performance go wrong and cannot find the line to recover. "That's absurd," she said, the word like a fingernail on glass. "There has to be a mistake. My father—" Her father, the VP, kept his jaw clenched like a man who would like very much to have time reversed by decree. Around the room, conversation flitted like nervous birds. "This clause is archaic," a partner murmured, "perhaps placed there as a courtship artifact when securing Aitchison's backing. Are we certain it's enforceable?" "Enforceability is not the question," Rourke replied. He folded the page with the ceremony of someone closing a book he had read enough times to know which chapters mattered. "Recognition is." The assistant in the room, the one who had fetched the files, looked at Rebecca as if for permission. Rebecca did not need to grant anything. The token had been shown. The clause had been read. The room had been made raw. What followed was the architecture of corporate scramble. Whispered calls, the soft panic of people who had honed their lives to work around soft centers of power that might now be compromised. Clients would call. Accounts might ask questions. The rumor windows would open, and in them 1,000 small people would find reasons to review invoices and request copies of transactions from quarters past. Richard sat down with a petulant thump, the sound of someone permitted to believe they were the protagonist and then given a subplot. "We will contest the reading," he said. "This was a contingency clause. We will consult counsel."
This. "Consult counsel," Rourke repeated, with a look like someone who had tried counsel before and found it thin. "Do so. You'll find the clause was drafted to be resistant to evasive maneuvers. It is not a myth, it is a procedure." In stark terms, the room had been split between people who liked the certainty of precedent and those who preferred it to be absent. Rebecca felt neither triumph nor relief. She felt the slow unwinding of something that had been coiled for years. The dress insult, petty, public, small, had exposed a seam. It had shown how thin the office surface was, and how easily it could be parted to reveal the internal scaffolding. The assistant left to fetch counsel. The board was still reassembling itself into a defensive formation when Richard finally rose and cleared his throat. He tried, with the practiced ease of someone who had managed crises before, to shepherd the meeting back to the numbers. But it was already too late for the old rhythms. Rourke's presence had been a lever. The clause had given the room a hinge, and things had started to turn. A junior analyst sent an email to the firm's auditor asking for a preliminary review of all transfers involving non-operational accounts over the last 5 years. It was the kind of request that made people in far corners of the building stand up straighter. Requests like that were the first sign of a chain reaction. Audits prompt questions, questions prompt freezes, freezes prompt calls to one another in panic. Money is as obedient as a rumor if someone with the right name calls for a ledger. Rebecca watched the small dominoes fall. She had not sought to watch them fall. She had only kept a small artifact close to her, the way someone keeps a compass in their pocket.
Leela sat very still now, the earlier performance stripped from her face like makeup rinsed off. For the first time that day, she looked unmoored. "Do you want anything?" Rebecca heard herself ask, an odd, practical question in the midst of the loosening center. Leela looked at her as if seeing her for the first time in a long time. "No," Leela said. Her voice had the sheen of a person who had been unseated and didn't yet know where to stand. Outside, in hallways and reception areas and among client teams who had been watching with the same mix of curiosity and dread, calls were being made. Major accounts that had liked to think of themselves as not easily moved were asking questions. The business of moving money is a business of trust, and trust is a fragile thing to balance on the hush of a clause. Rebecca slid the token back into place and buttoned the seam. She smoothed the fabric and walked back to the boardroom as if she were merely returning to watch a meeting, not as if she had become, by the act of an insult and a memory, an axis. When she entered, Richard was arguing with counsel. Rourke was calm, having the air of a man who had finally found the page he had been waiting for.
The partner chairs turned toward her with the polite curiosity of people who had once considered her an indistinct instrument of work. Leela stared at her with small, hard eyes. "You knew?" Leela demanded finally, the question sharp with a heat that sounded like accusation and surprise braided together. "Was this a stunt?" Rebecca shook her head. It wasn't a stunt. Leela's mouth opened and closed. The room leaned toward a collision between two women who should have been at different levels of concern entirely. The company had rehearsed the public spectacle of power. It had not rehearsed for the honest alignment of private histories and corporate documents. "There are people who thought Mr. Aitchison was a myth," a senior partner interjected, "that this was a kind of family story." "Myth has led to money," Rourke said simply, making the word ledger-like. "And when myth leaves a sign, it becomes fact again." The assistant returned with counsel, and the conversation shifted into tones too technical for anyone else to follow easily. Words like audit, suspension pending review, and access rights appeared like weather forecasts nobody wanted to listen to. The room had slipped from a meeting about acquisition to a terrain of precaution. Rebecca felt an odd detachment, the coolness of someone watching another person fumble with a map they had never been given. She had spent a long time studying small behaviors, like her father's handwriting, and had learned that the world often yielded power to those who knew how to wait. That afternoon, the firm was a place rearranging its furniture. Phones recorded messages on voicemail. Security maintained a presence that felt more vigilant than usual. Confidential memos were drafted with legal phrasing, meant to comfort shareholders more than anyone else. The rumor mill ran. The press had not yet arrived, but they would. They always did, in ways that made narratives of ruin and redemption feel like water brands. Rebecca walked out of the building before the sun had dropped to any meaningful angle. She moved without fuss. Her heels clicked on the marble, measured, even. Outside, the city hummed like it always did, uninterested and enormous. People with grocery bags passed by, indifferent. The world continues even when reputations are rebanked. She did not celebrate. She had not wanted fire. She wanted truth. That distinction mattered to her, the difference between taking power and insisting that the ledger be clear. She had no appetite for the board seat some of the senior partners would inevitably try to offer her now, nor for the symbolic elevation that rewards people who prosper from being spectacles. She had learned to carry inheritance like an instrument, not like a trophy. On the pavement, she stopped for a moment and pressed her fingers to the seam of the dress. The metal under fabric was warm, as if it had absorbed the heat of the day. She thought of my grandmother's voice. Keep it close.
Keep it hidden. Use it when the world demands honesty. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Scramble text. Well-timed. Well-timed, the text read. A smile emoji followed, small and careful. Rebecca pocketed the phone as if it were a stone you set down rather than a fire you tended. She folded the dress hem over the token, as always, and walked back into a building that suddenly felt older than it had that morning. The assistant who had brought the sealed envelope hovered like someone waiting for the correct moment in a play. "They're getting counsel on standby," she said. But Mr. Rourke asked his people to prepare a copy from Geneva. He said he would like corroboration. "Corroboration," Richard echoed.
as if the word could be shaped into armor. He rubbed his forehead in a way that suggested he was trying to iron out a crease in the fabric of a narrative he had always assumed would be flattering. Work did not need to expand on his request. He had the means and the sort of international patience that moves slow and then decisive. Within the hour there was a call from his office, a discreet line, a name Rebecca had heard in the margins of corporate gossip, Brandt & Co., Geneva, custodian of founding papers and other unglamorous proofs. There is a way old money uses bureaucracy as a hammer. It asks for what it wants through channels that make delay polite and consequence inevitable. They can send a certified copy within the day, Work said, into the room, not as a promise, but as an acknowledgement. If the clause is what I remember, then we will have to proceed as the document instructs. The senior partners blinked at one another. In meetings, people tend to misread a calm as indecision and a sharp move as hubris. Rebecca had learned to distinguish them. Calm was not always retreat. Sometimes it was the calculation before you change the locks. The assistant's phone buzzed, and she spoke quietly into it. "Courier en route," she said. "They have the serial number of the envelope." Phones began to move again, but this time like animals sensing thunder. A legal brief slid across desks. Karen from legal, who had been respectable in the way only career lawyers can be, meticulous, somewhere between maternal and mechanical, picked up the matter with trained reserve. "We will need to secure access logs, internal transfers, and any communications referencing hastened funds," she said. She spoke to Alan in compliance like someone laying out a shopping list of disasters that could become either paperwork or precedent, depending on how neat the receipts were. Alan's fingers made a small, efficient noise as he started to compile the first requests. "I'll lock a freeze on non-operational movement pending review," he said. The phrase was diplomatic and careful. Freeze meant not that someone was criminalized, but that the accounts would stop being a smooth puddle for opportunists to dip into. It meant transparency. It meant time to find the truth.
That truth revealed itself, as truths do when someone is willing to look for them, one paper at a time. The courier from Geneva arrived late in the afternoon with clean hands and a protocol that made the firm's compliance officer breathe a little easier. The certified copy of the founding agreement was delivered, stamped and sealed in a small archival folder. The document had the wear of something rarely opened and the authority of an old signature. It was not flashy. It was paper, folded into decades. Rarka tugged the folder from the courier with the quiet gravity of someone who had opened enough things to know the weight of what they contain. He did not fan the pages like a man who wanted to reveal a card trick. He placed the folder on the table and looked at the room with eyes that measured people like assets. "You will read it," he said. "All of you, slowly." They read it. In rooms like that, words are a current that can drown illusions. The clause they all found, precise, oddly deferential in its language, had been inserted at a moment when the company needed a kind of external guarantor. Edmund Hudson had been, in the phrasing of the time, benefactor and stabilizer. His instrument, the token, was not merely a charm. It was a device to identify an heir and to grant that heir observational authority. The clause specified that recognition by a principal client, someone with discretion and account weight, would trigger a right, access to accounts for audit, the ability to request third-party reviews, and a protective threshold against immediate dismissal by simple board vote. For a moment, the room was a place of rustling pages and the smell of archival glue. Then the world they had known shifted in small, rearranging increments. Emails began to flood in from clients who had heard fragments through their own networks. Phone calls lit up with the urgent tones that make assistants and VPs prey to voicemail settings. The firm's biggest accounts had people who slept with their financial histories like blankets. Trust companies circulated the phrase, "temporary suspension pending review," and those words have teeth. It didn't take an army, just a few decisive questions asked by people with money enough to make answers matter. A long-term client that had once called the firm indispensable requested an immediate preliminary audit. Another client in Europe asked for an itemized list of all transfers to non-operational accounts. A trustee from a pension fund phoned, voice steady but cold. "We will be pausing further allocations until the review concludes." Each call pulled at a thread. An auditor's preliminary scan was alight with magnifying lenses. The spreadsheets were tidy on the surface, but had notes and margins, moved entries that belonged in liabilities into miscellaneous, and a few wire traces that pointed to accounts with names like third-party facilitation, a euphemism that, on sober reading, looks less like facilitation and more like patchwork.
There were ledger entries dressed as refunds, client rebates hidden in narrative notes, and a trail of approvals that looped back to signatures that might not have been properly authorized. Nothing screamed crime, and the firm would be careful to avoid such language, but the sum of discrepancies looked like a pattern. and patterns, when illuminated by accountants and lawyers, become questions more formidable than rhetoric. Richard's phone hummed constantly. He answered with the manner of a man tasked with smoothing a kink that would not budge under steam. "We will cooperate fully," he told callers. He issued statements with the exact right tone for damage control: contrition without admission, concern without surrender. But a particular kind of pressure arrived on his doorstep when the boardroom door opened and Chairwoman Delgado entered. Delgado had been the company's guardian in ways that made people comfortable. She had the ability to say, "We will examine this," and have whole divisions reorganize themselves to do it. Where Richard had charm and habit, Delgado had authority and an appetite for governance. She walked in, took in the scene, and sat as if she had been placed there by long practice. "Security," she said softly. "We need someone with discretion in the next corridor. No cameras beyond this point." Her voice was small, but it had the administrative weight of a gavel. Someone, security, moved towards the doors with the kind of quiet competence a building of that size keeps on retainer. They were careful. Restraint in corporate spaces is often more effective than spectacle. The company did not want a circus. It wanted control. "Mr. Lang," Delgado said, and the use of his formal name was the smallest kind of public removal. "I need your cooperation." No one in that room wanted an ugly scene on the record. Richard had to decide between putting up a fight that would look worst in public and stepping aside while the firm sorted the mess. He chose for the moment something between. He exhaled like someone choosing a lesser embarrassment. "We will convene an independent audit," he said, voice too precise to be entirely sincere. "We will appoint a third-party firm. We will—" "Place yourself on administrative leave pending the outcome," Delgado said. "We will make the announcement consistent with counsel's advice." The words landed like an action rather than a negotiation. Administrative leave is a corporate sedation. You are neither fired nor cleared. You are merely paused, an uncomfortable limbo with consequences for reputation and control. Richard stared at her, then at the room. "It's prudent," Delgado cut in. "Mr. Work has raised points that require independent review. We will not risk compromise." Leela's face changed color in a way that made the room uncomfortable to look upon. It was the look of a person who suddenly realized the world had one fewer script for her to recite from.
She had been the public face of inherited advantage, practiced in the art of being cutting without cost. Now the cost was something her training had not prepared her to bear. "You're making decisions," she said, whispering, though the whisper carried accusation like a knife. "You're making them without." Corporate phrasing meant to calm. "Pending independent review," it read. "The following steps are being taken. Administrative leave for those with direct signatory control on non-operational accounts, immediate third-party audit, temporary restrictions on inter-account transfers, and an observer will be appointed with access to account review." Observers are curious things. On paper, an observer is a neutral party who watches and reports. In practice, an observer can be the fulcrum that makes secrecy brittle. The clause, a dry line hidden in an older contract, had given an heir a form of institutional vantage that could demand sunlight where there had been pleasant shade. Someone in the room, Karen perhaps, made the procedural suggestion, and it was accepted. The firm would acknowledge Rebecca's presence in the limited language the clause allowed. She would be given observational access to certain records. The board tried to be careful about freezing. They wanted to avoid granting anything that would feel like surrender. But the clause was specific, and Work had the will to make the air in the room thin. "Miss Hartson," Delgado said, turning toward Rebecca like someone handing a baton across a track, "we will need to formalize your role for the purpose of this review. You will be provided access to audit files and to request third-party reviews. Legal will set the terms." Rebecca listened. Her face did not supply the camera with drama. She had always been economical in her expressions. Inside, a clock moved. Memory, duty, a trace of family obligation. The token, warm against the dress, felt like a compass with its needle pointing to the old ledger. "Thank you," Rebecca said simply. Not gratitude, not triumph, recognition. The first wave of consequences that followed was the sort the office knows how to do: administrative, efficient, designed to keep public relations manageable. Security escorted Richard from the premises that evening under the quiet dignity of a man being afforded privacy. He left with a small leather bag and a face designed to carry indignation like a fashion accessory. Leela's badge was deactivated by the end of the day.
She walked out with a face like someone who'd been told she no longer had permission to exist inside a certain story. They were escorted, not humiliated in the street. The firm did what it could to avoid spectacle. That is a corporate mercy. Replace public spectacle with a private exit, and the narrative remained salvageable, if less so than before.
But private exits did not stop the public from asking questions. The kinds of clients who have money enough to write memos to their own boards wanted immediate clarity. The third-party firms asked for data that, in a normal month, would not have been collated for public inspection. The auditors wanted explanations for transfers that deviated from standard operating procedures. Each data request was harmless on its own. In aggregate, they formed a cavern. Rebecca sat with Alan and Karen for hours, not as an accused or a claimant, but as the person whose identification had been a trigger. She requested documents with the precise calm of someone who knows which file will creak a floorboard. She did not sway into outrage. She steered the review with the blunt instruments of facts and timestamps. She asked for the bank statements tied to the accounts whose names felt like euphemisms. She asked for the internal approvals tied to them. She pulled out copies of emails that had once been filed as routine client courtesy. Little omissions in the reports, an unsigned form here, an email that referenced a verbal approval there, began to look like the breadcrumbs that lead from sloppy bookkeeping to deliberate obfuscation. These are discrepancies, Alan would say, tapping a screen. We cannot claim intent, but the gaps in documentation are significant. Significant is a good word, Rebecca replied. It is also an action item. When a client calls to ask whether their funds have been handled with the expected integrity, the answer is not only a moral one, it is a fiduciary matter. Calls placed by trustees and institutions came in with the quiet force of people who keep minutes and remember phrases from annual reports. Each conversation pushed the firm further into the kind of scrutiny that makes reputations less supple. Malcolm Brand, the founder and chairman, arrived late that evening, an old man with the air of someone who had once been able to placate storms with a checkbook and a handshake. He sat with Delgado and Merck and spent an hour listening like a man attending the recount of an affair he'd preferred to forget. He stared at the pages the way readers stare at photographs that contain someone they used to know. I put that clause there to protect the company, he said finally, voice soft with the kind of regret that has nowhere to land but confession. I wanted a mechanism that ensured loyalty. I did not expect it to become a weapon. Clarity isn't a weapon, Work said. It's a lever. You've built something valuable here, Malcolm. That value depends on truth. Brand's hands trembled a fraction. Years make hands know what to hold and what not to let go of. What do you want, Mr. Work? He asked, like a man handing over a key and hoping the lock makes sense. Merck's reply was not theatrical. An audit, full transparency, and resolution, he said.
If the accounts have been misused, the firm will make restitution, where it can, and change its governance where it must. Brant nodded. There was shame and a kind of tiredness to it. He knew that the story of his company would now be told in a different voice for a while. He also knew, old men who build houses know this, that the foundation is what survives if you are honest about the faults. The next morning, the press was at the door. They were careful. No headlines yet, but enough curiosity to make the PR team draft a statement that lived in the safe middle ground between candor and corporate containment. We are cooperating with independent audit, the statement read. We will report findings as they become available. Rebecca's name circulated quietly in memos and in the gossip that occupies middle management inboxes. Some messages cast her as a savior who had exposed malfeasance. Others framed her as a disruptive force. None of it surprised her. She did not want to be central to a narrative about heroes or villains. She wanted the ledger to be right. That difference mattered to her. Truth above theater. As the audit moved forward, the third-party firm assigned to the job worked through numbers like a crew pulling at knots. They checked transfers against authorization, confirmed wire destinations, and called clients for confirmations. They found unauthorized transfers in language that could later be parsed by counsel into a spectrum of culpability. They found missing approvals and inadequate documentation. They found that some rebates and client credits had been rerouted through accounts designed for ease and discretion. The pattern they found suggested a culture that tolerated creative bookkeeping in the service of keeping deals moving. The auditors reported in blunt language to the board, "We have identified a chain of transfers that lack appropriate signatory documentation, and several instances where client rebate entries were not reconciled to client accounts. We recommend immediate suspension of involved signatories pending further inquiry and initiation of corrective measures." It was a paper equivalent of being pushed from a cliff. The firm could either scramble its narrative or accept the fall and try to rebuild on clearer ground. Board members parsed the wording with the anxious care of people who know their reputations are on the line.
The board voted, procedurally and with a seriousness that had the feel of a company deciding its own narrative, and placed Richard on leave and Leela under investigation as a person with access to sensitive communications. The vote was quiet, efficient, and suffused with the thin courtesy of people dealing with a storm in a teacup. Be precise, avoid melodrama. There was a moment afterward, short, human, when Leela was escorted from the building by a woman from HR whose face was flat and professionally sympathetic. Leela's eyes moved over the office and landed on Rebecca.
There was no performance left in them. There was only the sudden, disorienting comprehension of being dislodged. "Was it because of me?" she asked, voice small. Rebecca did not answer. There was nothing to say that would restore the place where Leela had stood. Silence in that moment was exact justice. Word of the audit's findings spread to the firm's clients like soft rain to dry ground. A couple of clients paused allocations. One long-standing investor sent a message that read, in its entirety, "We expect restitution where appropriate, and a clear plan to prevent recurrence." The language was not a threat so much as a note of expectation. Money, practiced in cautious phrasing, will make you prove you can be trusted again. Board members came to see Rebecca as something other than background. Some offered her positions, practical, measured offers that were designed to bind her loyalties. "We'd like to appoint you as an observer on a permanent basis, with a seat on the audit committee," Delgado said one afternoon. "We believe transparency now must be part of the governance structure." It was for them a tidy solution. Give the person who triggered the process a place at the table, and thereby fold her into an institutional authority they could manage. Rebecca considered the offer like someone studying a map. The seat had weight. It had the capacity to shape decisions, but it also had the tendency to become a seat in the theater the firm preferred, visible, politicized, preoccupied with optics. "No," she said, when Delgado waited for a reply. The word dropped into the room like a stone. It was not a refusal of influence out of spite. It was a refusal because the ledger and the checks needed to be clean, not parceled into new positions that might become seats of prestige. "I don't want a seat as a prize." Delgado blinked, just once, the single sign of a person accustomed to offers being accepted. "Then what do you want?" "Clarity," Rebecca said. "Audit, restitution where necessary, and public accounting of what happened, and independence for the auditors. I will cooperate with the process and provide whatever identification and access the clause requires, but I won't become the emblem of a cleaned-up image." Work, who had been silent in the corner, observed her with grave patience. "You're not after a title," he said. "You're asking for truth." "I am," she replied. "The company deserves to stand on its own facts." It was the kind of answer that left board members pleased because it was principled, and also safe because it removed a potentially messy novelty. They could contain a person who refused ceremonial fruit by giving them a role that had the precise boundaries they requested, access for audit purposes and nothing more. It was an arrangement that suited Rebecca. She had not wanted power for its own sake. She wanted to see the record cleaned. But power, even when refused, has consequences.
The firm's leadership, shaken and chastened, had to make public statements that would not create legal liability, but would show clients they were taking action. They promised independent auditors, new oversight mechanisms, and a review of internal approvals. They also had to manage a moral ledger, how to acknowledge that a culture of permissiveness had allowed questionable bookkeeping without calling names in ways that would be legally perilous. Richard's exit was handled with the quiet dignity of someone who had been given time to gather papers and collect his things. He left without theatrics, but he did not leave unknown. The stories of the routes through which funds had flowed remained a matter for auditors, and for clients now taking an interest. Leela's future at the firm was ambiguous. Reputational damage travels swiftly in the staircases of the city. She had to answer questions from HR and from legal, her social circle constricted. The world had ways of reminding people that advantage is conditional on perception and continuity. And Rebecca, she handed the token back to Rourke in a small private moment that morning, in a corridor where the light fell in a stripe like the place on a page you fold to remember. "Your family will want it," she said. She had thought about keeping it, what an heir could do with such an artifact of identification, but she had no appetite for being a symbol. Rourke's gloved fingers closed around the token with the same slow care he had used when he first lifted it in the boardroom. "This belongs where it belongs," he said.
but it also belongs to a record. We'll place it into the archive with an affidavit. It will be cataloged and preserved. Your family. My grandmother asked me to keep it close, Rebecca said, but she didn't ask me to keep it as leverage. She wanted the truth to be available when someone could read it. Rourke's eyes softened. He was a man used to people who used leverage, not truth. Then we'll honor that. When Rourke left the office building that week, he did so as a man who had nudged a machine into motion and watched consequence follow. He had leverage too, the ability to make accounts that felt like trusts think twice. He had used it not for spectacle, but to make a firm clean its house, and to ensure that a clause meant more than decorative ink. The firm announced a timeline for the audit and promised to publish the results in stages. It did what corporations do now when their reputations are endangered. It offered transparency in measures so that the market could evaluate the consequences. The stock did not crater, it shuffled. Some clients paused engagements and others stayed, their trust recalculated but intact for those whose investigations showed no harm. The company, chastened, set about redoing approval workflows, training staff, and instituting new dual signature requirements for accounts that had been previously handled with a lighter touch.
Months later, when the auditors released a summary report, the language was careful and definitive in the way corporate reports are. They documented discrepancies and lapses in internal controls, recommended restitution where necessary, and highlighted issues with documentation. The report named no crimes, only failures of oversight and lapses in process. The firm accepted the report and published an action plan. People in the office returned, changed in the ways that storms change people. There was more caution in emails, a new reverence for stamped approvals. Leela eventually left the company on terms that were mixed. There was a settlement and an agreement of non-disparagement. Richard's reputation had been bruised and would be hard to mend in the circles that mattered. Malcolm Brandt resigned from the active chairmanship with a statement expressing regret and a desire to see the company's culture renewed. Delgado stayed on as chair and oversaw the reforms with the steady hand of someone who likes tidy outcomes. Rebecca did not take a seat,